Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is the show where we take a stack of historical records, books, and deep research, and we extract the absolute most important nuggets of knowledge so you don't have to do the heavy lifting yourself. We are here to make you the smartest person in the room, or at least the one with the wildest historical stories.
And today, we are tackling a story that, honestly, it feels like it was written by a Hollywood screenwriter who just drank entirely too much coffee. But the craziest parts of this, they're actually completely historically accurate.
Yeah, they really are. We are diving into the source material, Princes and Yankee Jacks by Daniel Henderson. And I think before we even really get into the weeds, I have to address the parrot in the room. When I say the word pirates to you or to anyone listening, what immediately pops into your head?
Oh, it's the standard image, right? You're immediately thinking of the Caribbean. You're picturing the Jolly Roger, peg legs, maybe Johnny Depp, a buried treasure chest marked with a giant X, and, lots of rum.
Exactly, the whole Disney version of it. But for this deep dive, we need to completely shift our mental map. We are not in the Caribbean at all. We are in the Mediterranean. And we aren't talking about a couple of rogue independent ships hiding out in coves.
No, not at all. We are talking about state-sponsored industrial-scale piracy. That is the critical distinction we need to make right off the bat.
State-sponsored, meaning governments were running this.
Right. We are looking at the early 1800s, specifically the Barbary coast of North Africa. So we're talking about Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Morocco. These weren't outlaws hiding from the law. These were sovereign nations, and their entire economy was essentially built on a massive international protection racket.
It's the geopolitical equivalent of the mob coming into your shop and saying, nice ocean you have here. Be a real shame if something happened to your merchant ships.
That is exactly what it was. They demanded tribute. And into this massive shark tank swims the newly formed United States. And we really have to remember the context here. In the early 1800s, America isn't a superpower.
Right. We're the broke new kid on the block.
Exactly. We have no money, our international credit is terrible, and crucially, we have almost no navy to speak of.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the mission of today's deep dive. We are going to explore how a young, scrappy America finally decided it had had enough of international extortion. We're going to look at the horrifying reality of American sailors enslaved in Algiers, and we're going to follow a wild, almost unbelievable march across the African desert to literally overthrow a government.
And the source material we're using, Henderson's book, does something really interesting to tell this story. It's a historical narrative, but it uses a fictional protagonist to guide us through it.
A young guy named David Forsyth.
Right, David Forsyth. He acts as our eyes and ears, getting us into the room where the real history actually happens.
Which I love, honestly, because sometimes pure history books can feel a little bit, dry. Having a character like David lets us see the sweat on the brow of real historical figures, men like Stephen Decatur or General William Eaton. It anchors all the geopolitical stuff in real human emotion.
Precisely. It allows you to actually feel the stakes, because the stakes weren't just about trade routes and tariffs. They were about human lives. It was about national honor.
So let's unpack this. The story starts in Baltimore. Set the scene for us. Introduce us to our protagonist, David Forsyth.
So David is an orphan. He's being raised by a clergyman named Rector Ezekiel Eccleston in Baltimore. And David's backstory is a classic tragedy. His father was killed in the American Revolution, and his older brother, Alexander, is a sailor out on the seas.
And David himself is a bit of a wild child, right?
Oh, absolutely. He's young, he's restless. There's this great little anecdote early on about him climbing a greased pole at the county fair just to prove he can do it. He's craving adventure.
But there's also this mystery hanging over his head right from the very start. Because the rector isn't just some simple, quiet churchman.
No, he's not. And this is where the author hooks us with this treasure element. The rector was actually an explorer in his younger days. Years ago, he went to North Africa and he found what he calls a treasure tomb.
But the expedition went horribly wrong.
Horribly wrong. He was attacked by bandits. He lost his wife and his child in the attack.
So for him, this treasure is completely cursed.
Exactly. He keeps the map hidden away in a book. He wants absolutely nothing to do with it. It represents nothing but trauma and pain for him.
But if you're a young, adventurous kid like David, that map is like a siren song. He knows it exists, and he wants the adventure. But before he can even really scheme about finding it, we are introduced to the antagonist of the story, Murad the Egyptian.
Murad is such a snake of a character. He's this incredibly wealthy, mysterious figure who shows up in Baltimore, and he's claiming to be a Christian refugee fleeing persecution in the Middle East.
But not everyone in town buys his sob story.
Right. Commodore Joshua Barney, who, by the way, is a real historical figure, a genuine naval hero, he suspects Murad immediately. Barney thinks Murad is a spy for the Barbary pirates.
Now, that sounds a bit paranoid on the surface, but was that a real legitimate concern back then? Were there pirate spies in American ports?
Oh, absolutely, it was a concern. Intelligence was everything in this era. The Barbary states needed to know which American merchant ships were sailing, what cargo they were carrying, and most importantly, if they were heavily armed. Having a spy in a major shipping hub like Baltimore would be worth his weight in gold to the Dey of Algiers or the Bashaw of Tripoli.
Murad plays the part perfectly. He buys a ship called the Rose of Egypt. He lures David in, basically tricking this kid into joining his crew. But the betrayal is much deeper than just a bad employment contract.
Much deeper. Murad hasn't just hired David. He has broken into the rector's home and stolen the rector's book.
He has the treasure map.
Exactly. He has the map and he's hunting the tomb himself. So David is unwittingly sailing across the ocean with the exact man who stole his guardian's most dangerous secret.
It's a great setup, but just as this swashbuckling adventure is getting started, brutal reality crashes in. David gets some devastating news about his older brother, Alexander.
Right. David learns that Alexander's ship has been taken by Algerine corsairs. And this is where the narrative forces us to confront the actual historical reality of the Barbary threat.
Let's talk about what that really meant. Because when we say captured today, we might think of prisoners of war being held in a camp until a war ends. But this was completely different.
Completely different. They were sold into outright slavery. The source goes into deep detail about the conditions in Algiers, and it is just nightmarish.
Yeah, they talk about the Black Pestilence.
Plague. It swept through the slave quarters constantly. It was a death sentence. The enslaved Europeans and Americans were kept in what were called bagnios, these massive, overcrowded, incredibly filthy prisons. They were essentially dark, damp dungeons where men were chained up at night after doing brutal manual labor all day.
And the economics of the whole system were just incredibly cold. We aren't talking about political prisoners here. These men were literal commodities.
Exactly. Henderson lists the actual going rates. A ship captain was worth 2,000 sequins. A mate, like David's brother Alexander, was priced at 1,500 sequins.
I have to ask sequins, like the sparkly things you sew onto a dress?
No. Sequins were gold coins used in the region. It represented a very substantial amount of money. And here's the brutal kicker. The United States simply did not have the money to pay these ransoms. We were a broke nation struggling to pay off our Revolutionary War debts.
So these men, these American fathers, brothers, and sons, they just sat there. They rotted in these bagnios while politicians back in Washington endlessly argued over the federal budget.
That's exactly what happened. They were abandoned for years in some cases.
I want to pause on the geopolitics here for a second because this part really confused me when I was first looking at the sources. You had England and France at this time. Massive global superpowers with huge, heavily armed navies. Why on earth were they paying tribute to these pirate states? Why didn't the British Royal Navy just sail in and blow these pirate cities off the map?
That is the million-dollar question. It seems so counterintuitive, but the answer is cynical in the extreme. It was pure realpolitik.
Oh, so?
Think about it from their perspective. If you are England and you have a massive navy, you can protect your own merchant ships through sheer force. But if the Barbary pirates are out there attacking American ships or Swedish ships or Danish ships, well, that is less competition for your British merchants.
Oh, wow. So they were intentionally using the pirates as an economic weapon against their rivals.
Precisely. It was a strategy. There are actual historical reports that the British consul in Algiers would sometimes tip off the pirates when American merchant ships were sailing nearby. It was a cheap, effective way to strangle the fledgling American economy in its cradle without the British having to fire a single shot themselves.
That is genuinely infuriating. It makes you realize just how completely isolated and alone America was on the world stage at that time.
Completely alone. And I think nothing illustrates that utter humiliation better than the true story of the George Washington.
Oh, man. I want to really zoom in on this because when I read this in the book, I actually had to put it down for a second. It is visceral humiliation. Paint the picture of what happened here.
It's the year 1800. Captain William Bainbridge, who is a very capable, proud American naval officer, sails the U.S. frigate George Washington into the harbor of Algiers. His mission is to deliver the annual tribute payment, which honestly is already a shameful enough errand for a military officer.
Right, he's basically just acting as a delivery boy for a bribe.
Exactly. But he gets there, he anchors in the harbor, and the day of Algiers, the ruler looks at him and essentially says, "You pay me tribute, right? That means you are my servant, and I have an errand for my servant to run."
He essentially commandeers a U.S. warship.
Worse than just commandeering it, he turns it into a circus train. The Dey wants to curry favor with the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire in Constantinople. So he orders Captain Bainbridge to take his ambassador, his entourage, and his gifts to Turkey.
And the gifts aren't just, chests of gold or fruit baskets.
No, we are talking about a literal zoo. The manifest listed in the source material is absolutely insane. Lions, tigers, antelopes, ostriches.
On a wooden sailing ship. Imagine the smell.
Imagine the sheer chaos. You are the captain of a frigate of the United States Navy. You are supposed to be out there defending your nation's honor, and instead, you are hauling manure for a pirate king's pets. You literally have lions roaring in the hold of your ship.
And there's a cherry on top of this humiliation sundae, right? It wasn't just the animals.
Right, the flag. The Dey ordered Bainbridge to lower the Stars and Stripes and hoist the Ottoman flag at the masthead of the George Washington.
And Bainbridge actually did it. He lowered the American flag.
He resisted at first. He argued fiercely. But the Dey just pointed up at the massive harbor fortress. The huge cannons of Algiers were trained right on the George Washington's deck. If Bainbridge refused, the ship would have been blown to splinters, and his crew would have been sent straight to the slave banos. It was comply or sink.
So he sails out of the harbor. A sovereign American warship, disguised as a foreign vessel carrying a petting zoo. It really has to be the lowest point in American naval history.
It undoubtedly was, but in a strange way, it was necessary. Because when the news of that specific humiliation finally hit the papers back in America, something in the public consciousness snapped. The mood shifted almost overnight. The conversation went from how do we raise the money to pay them to how do we build ships to destroy them.
The famous phrase, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute.
Exactly. That became the rallying cry. And that cultural shift brings us right into section 3 of our dive, the era of what history calls Preble's Boys.
This is where the story gets incredibly cinematic. We are talking about the USS Constitution, the ship we know as Old Ironsides, and the men who sailed her.
Right. And in the narrative, this is where David Forsyth, our protagonist, manages to escape from Murad. There's a whole sequence with a mutiny on the Rose of Egypt, a massive storm, the usual high seas adventure stuff. And David eventually ends up enlisting in the U.S. Navy. He lands right in the middle of this legendary group of young officers.
We really have to talk about Commodore Edward Preble here, because the book describes him as a very hard man.
He was an incredibly strict disciplinarian. He came from New England, and he was tough as granite. He also suffered from a chronic stomach illness, ulcers probably, that made him notoriously irritable. The crew honestly did not like him at first, and Preble didn't think much of them either. He called his own officers schoolboys because they were all so remarkably young. We're talking about men like Stephen Decatur, Charles Stewart, Richard Summers. They were mostly in their early 20s.
Getting commanded by this grumpy, sick, older guy. But there's this amazing anecdote in the source where Preble completely wins them over.
The night encounter. I absolutely love this story because it perfectly captures his character. So Preble is sailing the Constitution in the Straits of Gibraltar at night. It's pitch black out there. Visibility is 0. And he hails a strange, unidentified ship in the darkness.
And the other ship hails back.
Right. The other ship claims, through the speaking trumpet, to be a British 84-gun ship of the line. Now, just for context, the Constitution is a frigate. It carries 44 guns. An 84-gun ship is a floating fortress. In a broadside engagement, it could easily blow the Constitution entirely out of the water.
And the British officer shouts over, "Send a boat on board." He's essentially ordering Preble to row over and explain himself like a subordinate.
Which, frankly, most captains would have complied with. You don't mess around with a ship that size in the dark. But Preble, he grabs his speaking trumpet and shouts back across the water, "I'll be damned if I send a boat on board any ship. Blow your matches, boys."
Blow your matches? That gives me chills.
Yeah.
That's the command to get the cannons ready to fire, right?
Exactly. The matches were the slow-burning cords used to ignite the cannons. He was telling his crew he was ready to fight a ship twice his size to the death rather than be ordered around by a foreign power. Now, as it turned out, the other ship was lying. It was a much smaller British frigate, but that didn't matter. The young American crew saw in that moment that their old, grumpy commander had a spine of absolute steel. They would have followed him into hell itself after that night.
And they effectively had to. because the situation down in Tripoli was about to become an absolute disaster. We have to talk about the loss of the USS Philadelphia.
This is the tragic flip side to the naval glory. Captain Bainbridge, the exact same poor guy who had to ferry the lions and tigers, is now commanding the Philadelphia. He is actively blockading Tripoli and chasing a corsair ship near the harbor.
And he runs aground.
He hits the Calusa Reef. It's completely uncharted. The ship slams hard into the rocks and sticks fast. This is a catastrophe of the highest order. A ship like that, stuck on a reef, is a sitting duck. It can't maneuver its guns. The Tripolitan gunboats see this, and they swarm out of the harbor like angry wasps. They completely surround him.
Bainbridge tries everything to lighten the ship, right? To get it to float off the rocks.
They do everything. They throw their heavy cannons overboard, they cut away the foremast, they pump out the drinking water, but she just won't budge an inch. With the gunboats closing in and preparing to rake his decks, he has no choice. He has to strike his colors and surrender.
So now the Bashaw of Tripoli has 300 American hostages, including the captain. But far worse than that, he actually has the ship.
He has a fully intact American frigate. Because just a few days later, a high tide and a storm dislodge the Philadelphia from the reef. The pirates drag it into the harbor, anchor it right under the massive guns of the Bashaw's castle, and they start refitting it. They are gearing up to use an American warship to hunt American merchants.
It's a total nightmare scenario. But Bainbridge, even while sitting in a prison cell, is scheming. The book mentions a letter he wrote in lime juice.
Right, invisible ink. He manages to smuggle a letter out to Commodore Preble. The invisible ink reveals a very simple, blunt message. The ship must be destroyed. You absolutely cannot let the pirates keep a weapon like the Philadelphia. It would shift the balance of power entirely.
Enter Stephen Decatur.
This is the exact moment that made Stephen Decatur an American legend. He volunteers to sneak into Tripoli harbor, which, remember, is heavily defended by massive shore batteries and dozens of gunboats, and burn the Philadelphia right under the Bashaw's nose.
And he doesn't take a warship to do this. He takes a ketch.
The Intrepid. It was a captured Tripolitan trading boat. It was small, it was smelly, and it was completely unassuming. He packs it with about 70 heavily armed volunteers, including our fictional friend David Forsyth, and they dress up as Maltese traders.
The tension in this scene, as described in the sources, is just incredible. They sail into the enemy harbor at night. The water is silent. They can see the massive, dark silhouette of the Philadelphia looming above them.
They get hailed by a pirate guard walking the deck of the Philadelphia. The guard yells, "Keep off!" And the pilot on the Intrepid, a guy who actually spoke the local language, shouts back, "We've lost our anchors in the storm. Please let us tie up alongside you just for the night."
It's the ultimate Trojan horse maneuver.
Exactly. And the guard actually buys it. They throw a rope down. The Americans grab it and pull themselves closer and closer, inch by inch in the dark. And then, at the last second, the guard looks down and sees the glint of weapons and the men hiding on the deck. He shouts, "Americanos."
And Decatur just yells, "Board!"
They swarm up the side of the frigate like pirates themselves. It's brutal, close-quarters combat in the dark. Swords, boarding pikes, tomahawks. But the Americans are highly disciplined, and they have total element of surprise. They overwhelm the guards and clear the deck in a matter of minutes.
And then they have to burn this beautiful ship.
They had specific teams equipped with combustibles. They ran down into the hold, set the fires in key structural spots, and got out fast. The wood was dry, and within minutes, the Philadelphia was a towering inferno, lighting up the entire harbor.
And what about Decatur and his men?
He didn't lose a single man, not one fatality. They piled back into the Intrepid and rowed back out to sea, dodging cannon fire from the shore forts, while the Philadelphia exploded behind them. Lord Nelson, the legendary British admiral, heard about it and famously called it the most bold and daring act of the age.
It's an incredible military feat. But I think it's important to note that the war wasn't just won by the brilliant officers. The book makes a real point to highlight the sheer grit of the common sailors. We have to talk about Reuben James.
Reuben James, he is the ultimate wingman in American naval history.
This story sounds entirely fake, like something out of an action movie, but it's literally in the naval records.
It absolutely is. This happens in a later battle, one of the gunboat attacks on Tripoli. Decatur is fighting hand-to-hand on the deck of an enemy pirate ship. He slips, and he's grappling on the deck with the pirate captain. Another pirate steps up behind Decatur and raises a scimitar, ready to just chop Decatur's head clean off.
And Reuben James, a common sailor, sees this happening.
Right. Now, James is already badly wounded from the fight, Both of his arms have been slashed and are basically useless. He can't lift a cutlass or a pistol. So what does he do to save his commander? He throws his own head in the way of the blade.
He literally headbutts a sword strike.
He essentially intercepts the downward swing of the scimitar with his own skull. It cuts him incredibly deep, but the deflection saves Stephen Decatur's life.
And the craziest part is he survived.
He did. He recovered from a massive head wound and lived for many years after the war. It's a wild story, but it really emphasizes the intense loyalty these men had. They weren't fighting for their pay, which, as we established, was terrible. They were fighting for each other.
So the war at sea is really heating up. We are winning tactical battles. We're burning their ships. But the Bashaw of Tripoli is just sitting tight in his heavily fortified castle. He still has the 300 hostages from the Philadelphia. Bombarding the city from the sea isn't forcing him to surrender. It's a stalemate.
And this is where the entire story pivots. If you can't win a war from the sea, you have to win it from the land. But how do you attack a walled city like Tripoli by land when it's surrounded by hundreds of miles of brutal desert?
Enter General William Eaton.
One of the most fascinating, erratic, and genuinely brilliant figures in early American history. The book refers to him as the American Lawrence of Arabia, and honestly, I think that moniker fits him perfectly.
Eaton was a former American consul to Tunis. And he was a very fiery, uncompromising guy. He hated the pay tribute policy with a burning passion. He was constantly writing these furious, demanding letters back to the politicians in Washington.
He was a man of action, and he came up with a plan that almost everyone in the government thought was completely insane. Eaton knew that the ruling Bashaw of Tripoli, a guy named Joseph, was actually a usurper. Joseph had kicked out his own older brother, Hamet, to steal the throne.
Classic royal drama. The evil younger brother takes over.
Right. And Hamet, the rightful ruler, was currently living in exile in Egypt, completely broke. Eaton's grand plan was breathtakingly simple, but logistically terrifying. Sail to Egypt, find Hamet, raise a mercenary army, march 500 miles across the unexplored Libyan desert, capture the coastal cities from behind, and forcefully put Hamet back on the throne, on the strict condition that Hamet releases all the American hostages and signs a treaty ending the tribute system forever.
It sounds like a complete suicide mission.
It practically was. But Eaton somehow gets the green light. He lands in Egypt. He tracks down Hamet, who is barely scraping by. And Eaton starts building his army, but calling it an army is being extremely generous.
It's the motley crew to end all motley crews.
It's totally absurd. Let's look at the composition. He had a grand total of exactly 8 United States Marines. Just 8 guys, led by a young lieutenant named Presley O'Bannon. Then he managed to scrape together about 25 European cannoneers. He hired about 38 Greeks who were basically just mercenaries looking to get paid. And then he recruited a massive, chaotic horde of Arab cavalry and local camel drivers.
So we're talking about maybe 400 people total.
Roughly 400 to 500. And in the narrative, David Forsythe is right there with them, acting as Eaton's personal secretary and aide.
Let's talk about the grueling logistics of this march, because Henderson goes into some really gritty detail here. This isn't just taking a long walk in the sand. This is a logistical nightmare of epic proportions.
It's the Libyan desert in the spring. It is blazing hot during the day and then freezing cold at night. They brought almost no heavy supplies because they couldn't carry them. They were constantly starving. They were eating hard sea biscuits so stale and hard that the men literally had to smash them with the butts of their muskets just to chew them, and whatever camel meat they could slaughter.
And what about water? That has to be the biggest issue.
Water was incredibly scarce. They were relying on these ancient, often dried up wells. When they did find water, it was usually brackish, muddy, and tasted like sulfur. There were times they went days without a proper water source. Men were hallucinating.
But the physical terrain and the starvation wasn't even the biggest problem. It was the people themselves.
The internal culture clash was constant. You have strict Christians and devout Muslims marching together in 1805 under immense stress. The Arab camel drivers were not patriots fighting for a cause. They were hired contractors. They didn't care at all about American honor or naval treaties. They wanted their money. And Eaton, quite literally, did not have much money to give them.
Which leads to the famous rice mutiny.
Right. The camel drivers completely went on strike. They stopped the caravan and refused to move another inch unless they were given more food rations or more gold. And Eaton couldn't give it to them because he simply didn't have it.
There's a scene described where Eaton faces down the mutineers, and it's incredibly badass.
The tension boils over. The Arab cavalry threatens to abandon the expedition entirely. They actually level their loaded muskets at the small group of Christians. It's a Mexican standoff in the middle of nowhere. 200 mounted warriors versus William Eaton, 8 Marines, and a handful of Greeks.
And Eaton doesn't flinch.
He doesn't back down an inch. He walks right out to the front of the line and shouts them down. He tells them, "We are bound to liberate 300 Americans from the chains of barbarism. If you want to leave, then leave. But you get absolutely nothing from me."
It was a massive game of chicken.
Yeah.
Played with starvation and dehydration on the line.
And Eaton won. His sheer conviction was terrifying. The mutineers backed down. He held that fragile, chaotic army together through pure force of will.
Now, amidst all this intense testosterone, guns, and sand, Henderson weaves in that fictional subplot we mentioned earlier, the girl in the desert.
Right. So as they're marching, David spots a young blonde girl in a nomadic Bedouin camp, which obviously immediately stands out in the middle of North Africa.
Eaton actually ends up using some of his scarce funds to buy her freedom. And of course, playing into the logic of a 19th century adventure novel, she turns out to be Anne the Rector's long-lost daughter. It connects right back to the treasure map.
It's a bit narratively convenient, sure, but it serves a purpose. It adds a very personal stake for David. He also befriends a young Arab boy named Mustafa, who becomes his loyal sidekick. It gives the reader a necessary emotional break from the relentless, grinding misery of the desert march.
But eventually, after 50 grueling days, they finally reach their target, the coastal city of Dern.
They have marched over 500 miles. They are emaciated. Their shoes have completely disintegrated off their feet. And they arrive at this heavily fortified city. General Eaton formally sends a message to the governor of Dern demanding his immediate surrender.
And the governor of Dern sends back a reply that honestly belongs on a t-shirt.
It's legendary. He replies with just 4 words. My head or yours.
You really have to respect the absolute confidence there.
So we get the Battle of Durney. This is the grand climax of the land war. And it was a surprisingly modern, coordinated attack. You had American Navy ships, the Argus and the Hornet anchored offshore, bombarding the city walls from the sea. And simultaneously, Eaton and his army led the frontal charge on land.
This is the exact moment where the United States Marine Corps legend is truly born. The line from the Marine hymn to the shores of Tripoli.
Exactly. Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon and his 7 Marines, alongside the Greek mercenaries, charged directly at the enemy battery. They ran through a brutal hail of musket fire. O'Bannon was literally the first man over the enemy wall. They seized the Tripolitan cannons, physically turned them around, and started firing them down into the town.
And then they raised the flag.
They raised the American flag over the captured fortress. It was a massive milestone. It was the very first time the Stars and Stripes had ever flown in victory over a captured fortification in the Old World.
It's a huge historic victory. They've successfully taken a major provincial capital. They have the Bashaw of Tripoli shaking in his boots. The road straight to Tripoli is finally open. They are ready to finish the war and rescue the hostages.
And right here, at the peak of the triumph, while the exhausted army is celebrating in Dern, the narrative splits. We get the satisfying fictional climax for David, and then we get the deeply frustrating historical anti-climax.
Let's do the fun fictional part first. The treasure.
So David realizes that the treasure tomb marked on his stolen map is located at a place called Tokra, which happens to be very close to Dern. In the chaos of the occupation, he sneaks off with his buddy Mustafa.
They locate the stone pillar from the map. They dig down and find the hidden underground chamber. And the rector wasn't crazy. It's all real.
It's an incredible haul. Ancient gold masks, massive silver bulls' heads, raw jewels. It's an untouched ancient hoard.
It really feels like the necessary payoff David deserves after suffering through the bagnios, the mutinies, and the desert.
They pack all this heavy treasure up into burlap sacks. And I love this clever little detail from the book. They label the sacks archaeological specimens, so the customs officers won't get suspicious. They ship them off on an American merchant vessel, the Morning Star, bound straight for Baltimore and the rector.
So the treasure is totally safe. David has won his personal quest. But then real history violently intervenes.
And this is where the story delivers a massive historical gut punch. General Eaton is fully ready to march on Tripoli. He has the military momentum. Hammond is ready to take his throne. The Bad Bashaw is terrified and ready to break. But then a U.S. Navy ship arrives in the harbor with the sudden news.
The biased Lear, the American diplomat.
Lear had been secretly negotiating with the ruling Bashaw in Tripoli the entire time Eaton was out in the desert fighting and bleeding. And Lear went ahead and signed a peace treaty.
Wait, why? We were winning. We had them on the ropes.
That's the great tragedy of it. Lear and several of the top naval officers felt it was better to get a guaranteed quick peace than to risk a prolonged, expensive land war just to put Hammett on the throne. So they agreed to pay a flat $60,000 ransom to get the Philadelphia prisoners back.
We actually paid a ransom after all that bloodshed, after the whole millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute speech.
We did. It was technically less money than the pirates had originally demanded, so Lear considered it a diplomatic win, but it was still a ransom payment. And far worse, part of the signed deal was that the United States had to instantly withdraw all its military support for Hammett.
So they just completely betrayed their ally.
They sold him out without a second thought. Eaton was absolutely furious when he got the orders. He called it a vile betrayal of American honor. But he was a military man, and he had his strict orders. He was forced to evacuate his American Marines onto the Navy ships in the dead of night.
The image of that retreat is just haunting. They literally sneak away to the rowboats in the dark, leaving Hammett and the hundreds of Arab allies asleep on the beach, only for them to wake up the next morning and find their American friends have vanished.
It was a moment of cold, hard, calculating realpolitik. And in our narrative, David Forsyth gets caught up in this chaotic withdrawal.
He's left behind.
He misses the boat in the dark. He's captured by the angry enemy forces who retake the city. And the irony here is incredibly cruel. After marching 500 miles across the desert to fight a war to free slaves, David is now sold into slavery himself.
The book takes us on a bit of a surreal odyssey at this point. David is sold to a nomadic caravan. He eventually ends up working for a traveling snake charmer named Muhammad.
It's a very colorful, almost bizarre section of the book. David is forced to act as the shill for the snake charmer. He has to handle live cobras in the town squares to draw a crowd and impress the locals. But eventually, the caravan travels west, and David ends up standing on the auction block in the main slave market of Tripoli.
And who ends up buying him?
The bad penny always turns up. Murad the Egyptian.
Of course, because Murad is still prowling around.
Murad somehow knows that David found the tomb. He wants the secret of where the treasure is hidden. He buys David at the auction and immediately throws him into the hold of his new pirate ship, the Hawk.
But David isn't a scared kid anymore. He survived a shipwreck. He survived the Libyan desert. He survived a war. He's not going to just roll over and let Murad win.
And luckily, he finds an unexpected ally on board the Hawk. The ship's mate, a guy named McWilliams.
McWilliams is a really interesting historical archetype. He's a renegade, which meant he was originally a Christian sailor who converted to Islam just to survive being enslaved. But he deeply regrets it. He desperately wants to escape and go home to his family.
So the two of them hatch a desperate plot. We get one last thrilling high seas adventure.
The mutiny on the Hawk.
They manage to secretly drug the Muslim crew's coffee supply. While the pirates are all passed out, David, McWilliams, and the other Christian slaves break out. They seize control of the deck. They lock the unconscious crew safely down in the hold. And instead of sailing back toward the African coast, they grab the wheel and turn the prow north.
Making a run for Plymouth, England. True freedom.
And Henderson gives us a really nice wrap-up twist here. McWilliams legally claims the ship as a prize, buys it, renames it the Dove, and becomes a highly respectable merchant captain. It's a great redemptive arc for everyone involved.
Finally, we get the homecoming chapter. David makes it all the way back across the Atlantic to Baltimore.
And the reunions are incredibly sweet. He walks into the house and finds his brother Alexander sitting there. Alexander actually made it home from his slavery years ago after the ransom was paid, and he is now a very successful merchant in his own right.
The rector has received the crates marked archaeological specimens. And most importantly, he has Anne, his rescued daughter, living safe and sound with him.
So they finally open those heavy burlap sacks, and it's a staggering fortune.
It's exactly the happy ending you want after reading about so much suffering and war. They use the gold to build new churches in Baltimore. And they even secretly send money to General Eaton.
Which is a really touching detail from the author, because in real documented history, William Eaton was treated horribly by the U.S. government. They refused to pay his debts from the Desert March. He died a few years later, largely in debt, bitter, and totally unappreciated by the country he served. So the fictional treasure money from David probably did a lot more for Eaton in the novel than Congress ever did in reality.
So taking a step back and zooming out, what does this all mean for us today? We've got this story that's half Indiana Jones treasure hunt, half gritty war documentary.
I think the real lasting value of Henderson's book is that it reminds us that the treasure, the real prize of this whole era, wasn't the ancient gold masks. The real treasure was the painful forging of a unified American identity.
Because this specific conflict really birthed the United States Navy's global reputation, didn't it?
Absolutely. Before the Barbary Wars, European powers viewed America as just a loose, disorganized collection of former colonies. We were just a weak trading post. But after watching Commodore Preble, Stephen Decatur, and William Eaton operate, the world realized that this new republic would actually fight. They saw a nation that would cross uncharted deserts, deliberately burn their own captured ships, and stand toe-to-toe with centuries-old empires.
And it gave the American public their very first post-revolution heroes. Real, incredibly flawed, gritty heroes.
It did, and at the same time, it left us with a very complex geopolitical legacy. We fought bravely for freedom, but we also made dirty compromises. We paid ransoms. We left loyal allies stranded on a beach when it was politically convenient. It's a very modern American story in that way.
That's a fascinating way to frame it. The mix of idealism and brutal pragmatism.
And here's a final thought to chew on before we wrap up. We focus so much on the glorious victory at Dern. But imagine, just for a second, if Tobias Lear hadn't signed that peace treaty. Imagine if General Eaton had actually marched his army all the way into Tripoli, overthrown the government, and put Hammett on the throne.
Oh, wow. We would have essentially installed a puppet government.
Exactly. The United States would have been actively in the business of armed regime change in the Middle East way back in 1805. How completely different would the last 200 years of global history look if we had successfully started that precedent back then?
That is really something to think about. A 19th century American political protectorate sitting right there in North Africa. The entire map of the world might look completely different today.
It almost certainly would.
Well, if you like this deep dive, do yourself a favor and look up the real life of General William Eaton. The man genuinely deserves a massive historical movie. And maybe check out Henderson's book if you want the full swashbuckling adventure for yourself. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.